everyone. It's Elena Berg, your host of Something in the Water, the podcast where we dive into the world of water from luxury mineral springs to the challenges of access, environment, and industry for a deeper understanding of what we drink. All right, we have made it. This is the final episode of this mini-series on drinking water. What we're doing today is we're going to circle back and revisit where we started. We're going to be speaking with Jan Bender, a small water farmer in Denmark, who for many years bottled a wonderful water called Iskilde. Jan has been extremely active in the mineral water world for a really long time, and is a really close colleague of Michael Tanousis, who founded the Fine Water Society and was on the first episode of this show. Now that we've had 9 weeks of water education, we're bringing it back to how small players in the water industry are particularly well suited to be water stewards, how engaging with the symbolism of water can promote a shift in understanding, and how we can communicate better with the larger public. And then when we're finished with that, I want to send you off into the world with some practical knowledge as a consumer. We're going to speak with Michael Tanousis, a water sommelier, about what to look for when we choose our water. Michael is the co-owner and CEO of Aquaminerology, which is a mineral water and beverage distribution company based in London. Michael's extremely passionate about the mineral water world, how products are regulated and labeled, the differences between waters and how we experience these differences, and ideas for better ways of describing this variation using consistent, globally recognized language. And by now, I hope you're curious enough about water to start experimenting with the different tastes yourself, whether you live in an area with many different mineral waters you'd like to try, or you just want to appreciate your tap water better. We will end with some final reflections about the future of fine water. And with that, let's get this show on the road. Our first guest today is Jan Bender. I've known about Jan for years, but didn't have the pleasure of meeting him until last year when we both attended the Taste and Design Awards in Athens. So welcome, Jan, and thank you for coming on the show. Listeners will know by now that I'm a sucker for an origin story, so maybe you can introduce yourself and tell us how you got started in this wonderful world of fine water.
The elevator pitch for Jan Bender. Yeah, okay. I'm a businessman. I've been working in the IT world most of my life. Built some pretty large IT computer and communication companies in Africa and in Europe. Then in about year 2000, I sold my group of companies. For a very short time, I had plenty of time and plenty of money, which is a poisonous combination. And then a neighbor of mine, I lived on a farm in Jutland, a neighbor of mine who had been drilling for water for his summer house, came over and told us that the water was sort of gushing out of the ground at an elevation of like 1.5 meters. And if we'd like to come and see, he'd never seen anything like that. So, and I'd never seen anything like that either. So we came over, and it was like, you see these oil wells in Texas or whatever, it was like quite impressive. And then at the time, Voss had just appeared on the market. Sort of a little bit thrilling and provoking that you could sell something that we regard as a standard product, which was ubiquitously available. Fascinating. But I thought if any water can be sold, then this water that's gushing out of the ground is suddenly so unique because it's gushing out of the ground that we should be able to sell it. So after a few weeks, I negotiated a deal with the guy who owned this land to buy the rights to commercially use it. At the time, I wasn't aware that this water was actually quite good. It was just fun that it came out of the ground. But as we started making analyses on it, it turned out the water was quite good. So we had this small production. It was just a hobby thing. And then Decanter magazine, well, quite a few years back, they made probably the largest comprehensive comparison of fine waters that's been made so far. I think they've taken all the brands, all the big brands, and some selected dark horse unknown brands, and they made this huge set of samples that made available to a very large collection of wine journalists and sommeliers and cooks across England. What made the whole thing fantastic for us was that number one was a small public water utility company in the Thames Valley. And the story that the best water in the world was from a small water utility, community water utility in the Thames Valley, went viral in the way things went viral at the times. That means the newspapers were covering this all over the world and magazines. And when they mentioned who was number one, they also mentioned who was number two. And since we were the only commercial product that made it to the top of the list, and nobody had ever heard of us, we suddenly got from day to day, from delivering to a few local restaurants. So we suddenly got calls from all the best restaurants across the world. So it was a quite dramatic change, and I decided to go for it. We scaled up a bit, and I set up a cooperation with Noma restaurant and with and a bit later with a restaurant called El Bulli in Spain. So we had the two of the best restaurants in the world working closely with us. So it was fantastic. And then came the pandemic, and we had to fire everybody and let things down. So we were really back to zero after the pandemic, which we used what we had to keep the company alive. So the companies were still operational, but we didn't have the funds to sort of finance a restart at that point. And then I met a couple of Danish people from the food industry, and they were interested in discussing how to restart. And I think that something could come out of that. So we're slowly setting the company up again now. So we're now at the 217th level in the skyscraper. It was a pleasure meeting you. I hope you enjoyed the ride.
Exactly. Well, it's funny. This has happened every time I've asked anyone to give the elevator pitch, is that what happens is it becomes the origin story. And I think that's also a testament to how difficult it is sometimes to summarize people's journeys through all of this in a few sentences, because often there are a lot of twists and turns.
It's easy to summarize, but then it gets meaningless. I think the problem is if you summarize too much, all the stories are the same.
Yeah, and I hope that that's something that this podcast has been able to capture, in part because I think the twists and the turns that people take make really interesting stories. But also to show that for independent producers and water sommeliers, water really is a passion above all else.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I know anybody that's become rich from making water. But there are probably some people out there, but I don't know. I've never met them. But I usually compare this to falling hopelessly in love with this fantastic beauty with a very hot temper and who is chronically unfaithful. And every time you think, this is it, now no more, that's it. Then she'll send you a kind smile and say, well, I'll give it one more chance. It's got this combination of love and hate, and it's absolutely not about money. One of the purposes of setting up the Fine Water Society when we did that was to try to make it more visible to the world that there was a difference between what you call the small-scale farmers and the large industries. But I don't think that difference is clear. I think one of the failures we did in the Fine Water Society has been the failure to communicate this outside our own world. It is like our means of communication right now, very, very much an echo chamber. It's getting better, and people like you, the water sommeliers, are probably going to be the ones who open the doors to the wider world.
Well, exactly. Those are the other two things I'm trying to do with this podcast, to communicate with the public, obviously, and to break out of that echo chamber that you're describing. But also I want to show the difference between what the small water farmers are doing, these people who are making sure that water gets out of the ground properly, versus the big companies that are coming in and buying a bunch of small ones, or even buying up the water rights themselves. But again, it's hard for the public to know if a small company is chosen to or had to sell out to a bigger entity or not. So they don't see the difference in terms of the day-to-day management.
Basically, by the end of the day, the issue of ownership is secondary. It's more like the way that ownership is administered. It's the production. It's the way the production is done.
But I think you bring up an important point. I guess my initial argument would have been that if you start getting into big production and big scale enterprise, that's inevitably where greenwashing starts to play a bigger role, because it's hard to scale up and still actually be a more sustainable product, right? You tend to distribute further. You tend to have a bigger carbon footprint. In fact, I just talked with Michael Tanousis, and we were talking about scaling up. His argument is that really it depends on how the product is produced and if the people producing it still are in touch with the product. And then, of course, the other issue is, aside from where bottled water is necessary for survival or safety, how do we justify putting it in a bottle ever?
If we have any justification, any reason for being, then it's delivering products which are unique and which to provide an experience, a unique experience.
It's so interesting because it reminds me of this difference between water and wine, right? Which is part of the tension that exists, that wine, we can just automatically put into this space of experience and enjoyment. But then you have this space that water occupies right now, where it's, of course, a necessary substance for human life. We need to drink water every day. And then we have this kind of tension between drinking water because we enjoy the flavors and we want to experience all of the different kinds of flavors that water can offer. And then we have drinking water that we need to drink to survive. We have lots of different histories kind of occupying this space.
It's like we become a symbol which was easy to understand and easy to communicate. Bottled water is something everybody can understand, and it's easy to change. If you looked at the total climate effect of smoking or eating sugar, candy, whatever, I'm sure that you get some scary pictures, but people don't really want to give it up. It's not important. Bottled water, it's an easy symbol to take up, but it just doesn't really make sense. To me, anyway, it doesn't make sense at all.
Yeah, no, I see that. I think I still keep coming back to the place of that tension that exists and I'm always trying to unpack it. Because I notice that in my students, right? That their immediate feeling is, well, if we could get rid of anything, why don't we get rid of something as superficial as bottled water? Like, we don't need to bottle water, so we should get rid of that. And that's always that first space. And I think that's based on the assumption that all water is the same.
It's obviously something you meet all the time, this issue. Less now than 15, 20 years ago. But I think the discussion is stupid. Frankly, I do. I think that the people who can seriously sit drinking a Coke, talking about the environmental impact of bottled water, should go back to school.
Yeah, I think you bring up an important point, which is that often people choose their cause and they don't actually examine how they're living their lives in other sectors. So I think there's a lot of problem with this. People really not maybe knowing how to examine all of aspects of the way that they live, but certainly deciding that they're going to have one symbolic fight and that okay, well, let's choose this thing. It seems obviously unnecessary. So I think this is where the water sommelier can come in and emphasize that that's not necessarily true, and that water has a greater value than we realize.
Even in the areas where we have access to plenty of water, if people don't value it, they're also much more likely to spoil deposits that we have and so on. So to help people understand that it's a valuable resource they need to protect and take care of is a part of our course.
So let's get into how water sommeliers can get people to think about water differently. We've talked a lot about water experiences, and that can mean many things. Water in fine dining, water menus, water tastings, water pairings. Is this the way we should go?
But I think that the words and the talk and the how do you see this is the interesting part. I think the pairing is ridiculous, frankly, between you and me and the podcasts. I think that except for a few very unique and strange waters, the Roy type of things, most waters will go excellently with most food.
Oh, interesting. Okay, because I actually found that to be one of the more compelling parts of the experience. So the way we did it at our table is that I went out and I found sort of a dozen waters that I thought were interesting and had, varying flavors. And rather than me deciding what to pair, I put them all on the table and I challenged all of us to try different waters with different foods and see what happened. And it's totally possible that was, in the moment and it seemed like we were tasting stuff, but it really did feel like certain waters paired particularly well, with those high or low minerality, with that there were certain kind of combinations that made the flavors pop.
I'm with you on the fact that they're different. The waters and food have a strong effect on each other. And of course, if there's a difference, there's also the possibility that somebody will like one thing better than the other.
Well, I really appreciate that perspective. There are very different opinions in the water world. I tend to view it as more of a subjective journey. So again, rather than telling my audience at the table what they should be drinking with their food, I just put it all down. And then we use that as an opportunity to have a conversation about what the different flavors did for us with the different foods.
That's exactly the way I think it should be done.
Yeah, well, I think that's also that the more I do science, the more I learn, the less confidence I have that I really know what's going on. And I think that's a humility that I think should happen, with age and experience in this world, because we realize, wow, okay, I've just tapped into something, but there may be more going on here. I mean, an example would be the PhD research that I did. I studied the same bird for 3 years. I spent 8 months a year living in the tropical forest with this bird. And by the end, I'm not sure I understood that bird any better. I realized that there were sort of, depths to this animal's social life that I was never going to understand. So I came out of there really, in some ways, knowing less than I did when I went in, or understanding that there was more to it. But in any case, how then, other than at a restaurant with people right in front of you, can the fine water industry make people, the consumers, aware of all the fun things you can do with water?
I'm sure most people, if they're buying a wine and if they don't know it in advance, they'll either check it on the net where it will be a written description, or they'll at least be reading the back label. So we're used to the fact that the product is communicating the basics in words which we can recognize and put into a reference, and then enjoy it in a setting where a lot of other things than the basic product will affect how much or how little we're enjoying it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of the water industry is already putting labels on where they're trying to describe the water. That was actually one of the fun experiments I did with my students, where we tried to pair the label with the water. And turns out, I mean, it's hard to know how to interpret these results because they were students with no experience at all tasting different waters or thinking about this, but had a terrible time matching what they were tasting with how it was described. Partly because the terminology was more about like, you can taste the waterfall over the rocks, right? And that doesn't actually give you language that you're talking about, right? Which is concrete and objective, that kind of ties those particular minerals to particular kinds of flavors that you can describe.
We're not talking about the taste of the waterfall or the angels flying over the water because we want to. We're talking to it because we don't have things to say, which, I mean, we've tried to use some of the sommelier comments on our labels, and I think it's difficult. If you ask people, what is your impression, it may not be similar to the words they use. It's difficult.
Right. Well, I think this is a space where there's a lot of room to explore because it's almost a blank slate as it stands. And I'm curious to see where we go with it. Jan, I want to say thank you for your time today. I've always appreciated your passion and your focus, and I look forward to our continued conversations.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
That was Jan Bender, everyone, and we'll be right back after just a short moment to talk to Michael Tanousis about what you need to know as a consumer if you want to start exploring the experiences that we just talked about.
Hello, I'm here to tell you about South Pole, a brand new podcast all about the science of Antarctica. This Antarctic expedition unpacks the science of its unique wildlife, massive ice sheets, and its importance to our global climate. It also does storytelling to reveal the human side of Antarctica. Famous expeditions, female explorers, extreme sports, and geopolitics from the Cold War. Search for South Pole and subscribe wherever you're hearing this now.
Welcome, Michael Tanousis. Maybe you can start by introducing yourself for us.
Yeah, I suppose it is a little difficult to introduce myself off the cuff, but then I do inhabit myself, so I should have a pretty good idea of who I am. I'm Michael Tanousis, and I am a co-owner, co-founder, and CEO of Aquaminerology. We're a UK-based company that specializes in fundamentally the distribution and retail of mineral water and bottled water and soft drinks. And beyond that, I've also been on a personal quest since starting the business to try and find consistency and meaning in what it is that we're selling. And is it really the case that we're just fraudulently selling water in a fancy bottle to people when there isn't really much difference?
Okay, that's fantastic. That's actually pretty concise. So, I mean, I like the kind of exploratory angle of that too, that you're on a quest to figure this out. I think as I am too. From my perspective, I started with my journey being quite a critic of bottled water because I saw all bottled water as kind of the same thing. I didn't have an understanding of the different companies and different brands and different approaches to bottling water. In a way, at the time, I went into it as a way to, okay, well, how do you understand your enemy? Well, you go in from the inside and you try to see what their operations are like from the inside. So since I started looking into all of this, I can see that there are vast differences between a processed water, essentially tap water that's put into a bottle, versus a single source mineral water.
In the UK, the narrative common narrative with respect to bottled water, and the predominant engagement with most media will always be prima facie, it isn't bottled water. Why would you go to the cost of transporting bottled water to our country when we have perfectly clean tap water available? So the conflation between the two transparent, clear, wet substances is something that is misunderstood at the very fundamental classifications of the two products. So when I'm engaged with this question, I'll quite clearly point out that whilst both are water and wet and transparent, the key difference is that one of them is microbiologically pure at source, and the other one is chemically cleaned in order to be safe to consume. People can't tell the difference between them, and so it's easy to criticize and easy to focus on the means by which the product arrives in the shop, at their table, in the restaurant, rather than the nature of the properties of water itself. If we invite the listener to step through the looking glass and look at things from the less frequently seen perspective, from my point of view, having spent a number of years trying to understand the nature of naturally sourced water, the virtues of the product, and I say it's a product, the virtues of this natural substance sourced naturally are hidden in plain sight. The products, as they're packaged, are presented to the consumer in a way that gives them access to all of the information that they need to make a meaningful insight, an understanding and positive decision for themselves, partially because of the way they're constructed and they're not very easily interpreted, and partially because market forces, they keep bending the rules and then deliberately obfuscate the nature of the message to the consumer, and partially through maybe apathy or lack of available information. It's just difficult to understand. I mean, I was involved with desperate consultations where they're speaking to the water industry about how can we simplify, or do we have an opportunity to simplify the messaging on the bottled water regulations? And this was a large part of that conversation, is how can we make this product more approachable for a customer to really represent it for what it is, which is ultimately the top of the tree, a single product from single source, and that source doesn't change. If we talk about, introduce the listener to what the difference is between products that are sold in bottles that contain nothing else but water, you have three categories. One is table water, the next is spring water, and the final is natural mineral water, and it's a hierarchy. And table water is basically a water that isn't from a measurable ground source or of unspecific origin. So table water could be opening the tap, putting it in a bottle and sticking one's name on it and saying Joe Blogg's water or Joe Blogg's fancy water or something like that. Then you have spring water, and spring water has to be microbiologically pure at source. But spring water is a mechanism that enables a marketing brand to sell water with one consistent marketing name, such as Highland Spring, but the source doesn't have to be the same for that brand's name. And it doesn't necessarily have to be from a ground source either that's regulated. You can give a typical analysis, or you're not obliged to give any analysis actually. And a natural mineral water, which is the top of the tree, and it has to say natural mineral water, has to be sourced from a single place, and the minerals in it have to be consistent. It's measured for 2 years before it can get the title of natural mineral water or the accreditation, certification, classification. And it has to be bottled at source. It can't be tampered with in terms of, well, they're only regulated interventions, if you like removing of iron and bromide. Essentially, it's a product of provenance, and it has to be continually measured and regulated. So if you want the highest form of quality, natural mineral water offers that to the consumer. But size of font and spring name doesn't have to be the most visible thing on the label. So it can be away and then you can see the brand. So that's where the confusion starts to creep in. And with spring water, the name there can be augmented. So it can say organic spring water. And with table water, it doesn't even have to say table water. It could just say anything other than natural mineral water or spring water. And so once again, you have this Pandora's box of inverse potential for marketing terms and appealing to the consumer with your product, and yet the most highly regulated of the bottled water products is straitjacketed by the need to state nothing other than natural mineral water. Really, the approachability or transparency of the classifications, regulations they're concealed to the consumer unless they understand the classifications, which is a bit of a shame.
Okay, so there are a lot of inconsistencies here. How do you recommend that we tidy this up?
I would be a fan. I would advocate something like a more prosaic name, like protected single source. That's what I would rename natural mineral water, something along the lines of protected single source water. And that way, people really understand what they're engaging with and they can make an informed decision. Or I would put a QR code on the cap, which enables people to take a photo and understand what they are receiving and what they're not receiving by engaging with their choice of bottled water that is masquerading, in some instances, as a bona fide protected single source water. I think that's enough. Is to create a tipping point to capture the people who are curious enough to understand about where the origins and the difference between products.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. It would be nice, actually, I think, to have a little bit more of a global language around all of this.
The next question is to understand what's on the label. And generally in Europe, you have to put the actual analysis of the minerals, the abundant minerals that are present in the water on the label. Now, the minerals that have to be present on the label aren't regulated. It's down to the producer. So, for example, some of them might want to inform the consumer that there are very few nitrates within the natural mineral water. Nitrates are indicative of organic pollutants such as rotting vegetation and leaves, etc. But over, say, 10 milligrams per liter or 15, they can also be indicative of man-introduced pollution as well. So this would be stuff like pesticides penetrating grounds and then the water source as well. So the fact that the minerals are regulated, which is the fundamental ethos of natural mineral water, enables us to have some consistency in understanding what is going on with that water. What is the character of this water? What is its fingerprint, if you like? What's its mineral fingerprint? And that is the crux of it. The beauty of the natural mineral water regulations or bottled water regulation as they're created is that they are designed to enable consumers to access mineral salts that occur naturally in water as a universal solvent for their physiological well-being. So the beautiful thing about water is that the regulations recognize that mineral salts in water are beneficial for the human body. And that's what they're designed to create right in the beating heart of the bottled water regulations. And this is what I mean by stepping through the looking glass and seeing things from the perspective of those with the knowledge of the industry and the insight of the labeling and the product, is that for you, the listener, the minerals that occur within natural mineral water are beneficial or will affect your body in some way. So fundamentally, when it comes down to it, a natural mineral water is a source of wellness. These are gifts of nature that will affect your body in a positive way and almost never in a negative way, although there are some mineral waters that are so mineral rich that you can't really drink more than a small glassful because it will give you the runs or affect you in some other way because of the sheer amounts of sulfates and other minerals in there.
Okay, so I think that gives us a really clear sense of water as a source of nutrition, I guess, which is not the way people often think of water. They think of it as a necessary kind of backdrop. I think in general, people have a pretty poor understanding of how much calcium they need, how much magnesium they need, what these minerals actually do in the body physiologically. So there's also space there to kind of, for people to understand biology a little bit better and what their bodies need.
Yes, and because one can't make health claims about their products, one can only state contains magnesium. And it's up to the consumer to say, is magnesium good for me? Do I need it? Do I want it?
And then I think this segues to this other piece of how do we, beyond what our bodies need in terms of nutrition, how do we experience these different flavor profiles of water and develop preferences?
Absolutely.
And that's where I really wanted to ask you about the work you've been doing to develop that lexicon. And, maybe first starting with, well, why is that lexicon important? There isn't a globally appreciated vocabulary for thinking about how these different minerals affect taste. So I wondered whether, you can walk us through a little bit of where you think the industry needs to go.
Before I start talking about taste and blah-de-blah, natural mineral water is the expression of the variety and the presence of mineral salts within H2O. Those mineral salts will vary depending on the journey that they've taken to the source. And you can get some mineral waters which are maybe 20 to 30,000 milligrams per litre, possibly more. And these are commercially available products in their territories, such as Russia or Ukraine or Hungary. Hungary has very, very rich thermal springs, Czech Republic. Then I started doing water and wine tasting, which was under the project named Minerals and Terroir. And we discovered that water can affect the experience of wine on the palate, and water can affect the experience of whiskey and tea and coffee and other beverages. So the minerals in water were definitely significant to add a variance to the palate in terms of taste. So they would affect the taste of other things. But water doesn't reveal a taste. The mineral salts in water create a physiological effect on the palate. Mineral salts can affect the texture characteristics of H2O. So they can affect the viscosity of the water. They can affect the feeling of weight or lightness of the water at various stages when you interact with it. When you first drink it, when it's on your palate, when you swallow it. And there's also the after effect of the minerals on the palate too, which continue to evolve through the presence of the mineral residue that remains on the palate as well. So that was really the starting point of me recognizing that there could actually be a way in which we could describe the experiences that everyone is talking about. Not everyone, a number of people are talking about subjectively, without really adequate words to describe it other than oily, creamy, minerally, flinty, whatever words that we choose to use to describe it.
So what that implies then is that we could potentially develop a vocabulary, but that vocabulary certainly won't look like the vocabulary that's being used for wine, for example, which has much stronger flavor profiles, and there's so much fruit that goes into how different wines taste in different contexts. So it would have to be a really different kind of vocabulary for water.
But the opportunity is that we have what's known as a tabula rasa, which is a blank slate, in order to codify and formalize a language for water from the ground up, which for me is very exciting. So that's really where the opportunity presented itself, and how I started to develop the concept of what has now become aquaminerology. But how I see aquaminerology evolving, Elena, is that it'll become the gold standard of water tasting, if you like to use that word again. It'll be, I think, water sommeliers for me, because right now it's a disparate notion which uses coincidental words, and it's a very subjective communication of an experience people are clearly having.
I think I'm really intrigued to see where we go over the next few years in terms of professionalizing the language that we use around it. And I think it doesn't sound like there are very many people who are trying to do what you're doing now. So I'm really intrigued to see where it leads. All right. Well, I'm looking forward to it. Thanks again. I really appreciate it. And talk to you soon.
Cheers, Lena. Nice speaking to you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. Well, folks, we did it. We made it through all 10 episodes of this miniseries. We learned what a natural mineral water is and how we can enjoy these waters. We traveled all around the world, from England to India, from Australia to Austria, and all the way down to South Africa, to learn how small water farmers and water sommeliers have made a career out of their passion, and how they stand on the front lines, in many ways, of the environmental resource management and water education worlds. or at least they're very well positioned to do this kind of work. We talked about sustainability in context in each of these places and how local solutions are really the best approach to really address any environmental issue we might be facing. We talked about public trust in the tap, public and private ownership, water rights, and what makes water such a symbol. I wanted to create this show because of the increasingly central role that water is playing in local and international politics and society, particularly as we start experiencing the impacts of climate change. As an environmental scientist, I've been intrigued by the conflicting messages about mineral water and the bottled water industry as a whole, and I really wanted to dive right in. My hope is that after these 10 episodes, you now have a more nuanced understanding of water, what it is, where it comes from, the environmental challenges that we face, and the notion that our access to clean, fresh water has to be managed locally but has global consequences. I also hope you can appreciate now that not all water is the same. It comes from different places and it's managed differently. In most cases, the water from your tap is not the same as the single source mineral water that you might drink from a bottle, or from the source itself if you are very, very fortunate. Water is precious, and we should appreciate it for the wonderful, life-sustaining, and delicious substance that it is. This mini-series is now available on the internet as an archived package of information and water education for people to return to show others, to engage with, and I think that's pretty cool. I was obviously nerdy enough about the topic of water to make a whole podcast about it, but over the past couple of months, as I've dug my fingers in even deeper, I've realized how much more there is to this world of fine water. We really have so much more to talk about. In addition to interviewing more small water companies across the globe, I would love to learn more about municipal water management and water filtration systems in the home, changing technologies in the world of plastic and water management, more about the social justice issues underlying access to fresh, clean water. At the same time, I've also become increasingly intrigued by the emerging gastronomic trends in the fine water world. People are experimenting with water and food in really cool ways, including cooking with different kinds of waters, carbonating water in new ways, pairing water with food and wine to bring out the best in all of these worlds. So we have a lot to explore, and maybe we'll come back to this. Lastly, before we close out this episode, I want to say thank you so much to all of you listeners who listened to me nerd out and followed me throughout this journey. My kids have been very patient through the recording of all these episodes, so I just wanted to give them a chance to say hello as well, and in this case, actually to say goodbye. So here we all are.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you so much for listening to this final episode of Something in the Water. I'm your host, Elena Berg, and I absolutely loved putting this podcast together for you. Something in the Water was produced and written by myself and Clark Marchese. Something in the Water is part of a larger network of environmental podcasts called Pine Forest Media, so I definitely encourage you to check out some of our other shows. More information about Pine Forest Media, as well as full transcripts, can be found at pineforestpods.com. I'll also say that while water is more of a recent hobby for me, my main focus as a scientist has been animal behavior. And if I were spilling secrets, I would tell you to stay tuned for my next podcast about all of that. The music you're listening to was produced by Joseph Salvat, who is my friend and a previous guest on the show. Cover art was made by Sarah Glavan, and the show was edited by Clark Marchese. Finally, thank you to the American University of Paris for making this podcast possible. If you feel called, writing a review and giving us a 5-star rating is the best thing you can do to help us out so that we can keep making more sciencey podcasts in the future. So until next time, goodbye!
Bye.